never thought I'd find myself in a standoff with our homeowners association president, but life has a way of throwing curveballs. My name is Nathan, and until 6 months ago, I was just another homeowner in Oak Ridge Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood. I'm an architectural engineer who appreciates good craftsmanship and proper procedure, two things that were completely ignored when Diane Holloway, our self-appointed neighborhood queen, decided my backyard shed needed to go. I purchased my home 3 years ago from an elderly gentleman named Frank, who was moving to Florida to be closer to his daughter. Frank was a master carpenter who had built many custom features in the house, including a beautiful cedar garden shed. When I bought the place, he specifically mentioned how proud he was of that shed. He'd constructed it 30 years ago, and it had weathered every storm without issue. The real estate listing even featured it as a selling point: custom-built cedar workshop with electricity and insulation. I maintained the shed meticulously. I repainted it the same warm honey color Frank had chosen, fixed a couple loose shingles, and added hanging planters around the exterior. It was my weekend sanctuary for small woodworking projects. Nothing noisy, just peaceful crafting that helped me unwind. Everything was fine until Diane Holloway was elected HOA president last year. She'd campaigned aggressively for the position, promising to restore property values and enforce standards. What nobody realized was that her version of standards meant conformity to her personal aesthetic preferences. Our first encounter was benign. She left a notice about my lawn being half an inch too tall. I complied and mowed it the same day. Then came complaints about my garbage cans being visible from the street. They weren't. Followed by a warning about unauthorized wind chimes, which had been there since Frank's time. I addressed each issue politely, even though the nitpicking was excessive. But the shed, that became her obsession. One Tuesday, I returned home to find a violation notice taped to my door. "Unapproved structure in backyard," it proclaimed in bold red letters, "must be removed within 30 days or fines will be assessed." I was confused. The shed predated the HOA by at least a decade and had been explicitly included in my property documentation. The next morning, I called Diane directly. "Mrs. Holloway, this is Nathan Pearson from Oak Ridge Drive. I received a notice about my garden shed, but there must be some mistake. That structure was built 30 years ago and was approved when I bought the property." Her voice was cool and dismissive. "Mr. Pearson, our bylaws clearly state that all exterior structures must conform to the aesthetic guidelines established in 2018. Your shed is non-conforming. The wood is the wrong color, the roof pitch doesn't match standards, and it exceeds our size limitation." "But the shed predates those guidelines," I explained calmly. "It should be grandfathered in, according to Section 4.3 of those same bylaws." There was a pause. "I'll have to review that. In the meantime, the violation stands." I decided to be proactive. That weekend, I found the original approval for the shed dated 1988, signed by the then head of the neighborhood association. I made copies, drafted a polite letter explaining the situation, and delivered everything to Diane's house. Her husband, Mark, answered the door. He seemed uncomfortable but took the envelope. "I'll make sure she gets this," he promised, glancing over his shoulder worriedly. 2 weeks passed with no response. Then I received another notice threatening a $100 per day fine if the shed wasn't removed within a week. I decided to attend the monthly HOA meeting to address the issue publicly. The meeting was held in our neighborhood clubhouse. About 20 homeowners were present, mostly older residents. Diane sat at the head table, wearing a cream-colored blazer that seemed excessively formal, her ash-blonde bob immaculately styled. During the open forum, I explained the situation with my shed, presented the documentation showing its approved status, and requested that the violation be rescinded. Diane's response was immediate and dismissive. The guidelines were updated in 2018, and all structures are subject to current standards, regardless of when they were built. "That's not what the bylaws say," I responded, pulling out a highlighted copy. Section 4.3 specifically states that structures approved prior to the adoption of new guidelines are exempt unless they undergo significant modification. My shed hasn't been modified at all. Several of the older residents nodded in agreement. Walter, from 3 doors down, spoke up. "He's right, Diane. We specifically added that clause to protect existing structures. I should know, I helped write it." Diane's face flushed slightly. "The board will take this under advisement and issue a final determination next week." That should have been the end of it, but Diane Holloway didn't operate in a rational world. She operated in a world where her authority was absolute. The final determination arrived 3 days later. The violation stood, and fines would begin the following Monday. The letter included a new justification, that the shed represented a safety hazard because it hadn't been inspected recently. I consulted an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. Lisa Chen reviewed my documents and assured me that my position was legally sound. "This is a clear case of selective enforcement and procedural overreach," she explained. "The HOA can't arbitrarily enforce rules against structures that were explicitly exempted." Lisa drafted a formal response letter, citing the relevant bylaws, documenting the shed's grandfathered status, and requesting all board meeting minutes where my property had been discussed. The letter concluded with a statement that we would pursue legal remedies if the violation wasn't rescinded within 10 business days. I hand-delivered this letter to Diane's house, again finding Mark at home alone. This time he seemed genuinely apologetic. "Look, Nathan, for what it's worth, I think this whole thing is ridiculous. The shed looks fine to me." I appreciated his candor. "Thanks, Mark. I'm just trying to resolve this reasonably." He lowered his voice. "Between us, Diane's been on a tear lately about neighborhood standards. Just be careful. She doesn't like being challenged." His warning seemed oddly ominous, but I was hopeful that the attorney's letter would bring a resolution. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, I left for work at my usual time. It was a busy day with back-to-back meetings, so I didn't check my phone until lunch. There were 7 missed calls, 3 from my neighbor Elaine, 2 from Walter, 1 from Mark Holloway, and 1 from a number I didn't recognize. I called Elaine first. She answered immediately, her voice urgent. "Nathan, you need to come home right now. Diane brought a contractor to your house this morning. They're tearing down your shed." For a moment, I couldn't process what she was saying. "What? She can't do that. That's trespassing and destruction of property." "I tried to stop them," Elaine continued. "I even called the police, but Diane showed them some HOA document claiming they had the right to remove hazardous structures. They've already knocked down 2 walls." I felt a surge of anger but forced myself to remain calm. "I'm on my way. Please take photos and videos if you can." I called my attorney from the car, briefly explaining what was happening. She was shocked. "This is absolutely illegal. The HOA has no right to enter your property and destroy structures without a court order. I'll meet you there." When I arrived home, I could see the activity in my backyard. A small bulldozer was parked on the lawn, and several people were around what remained of my shed. My beautiful, 30-year-old cedar workshop was now a pile of splintered wood. I found Diane supervising a contractor operating the bulldozer. 3 of my neighbors were standing at the edge of my property, looking distressed. Mark Holloway was there too, his face pale with dismay. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice steady. Diane turned, seemingly unsurprised. She was dressed in business attire, as if destroying someone's property was just another meeting on her calendar. "Mr. Pearson, we're removing the non-compliant structure as authorized by HOA bylaws," she replied coolly. "You received multiple notices and failed to comply." "This is illegal trespassing and destruction of private property," I stated firmly. "You had no right to enter my property without permission or a court order." She produced a document. Section 7.2 authorizes the HOA to remove hazardous structures after proper notification. You were notified. My attorney arrived and quickly assessed the situation. "Mrs. Holloway, what you're doing here is unequivocally illegal. The HOA bylaws do not supersede state property laws. You are currently committing criminal trespassing and destruction of property." A police cruiser pulled up. Apparently someone had called 911. 2 officers approached, and the senior one asked what was happening. Lisa explained the situation concisely, showing him copies of the relevant documents. Diane attempted to interject with her interpretation of the HOA bylaws, but the officer raised a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, regardless of your HOA rules, you can't enter someone's property without permission and destroy structures. That's criminal trespassing and vandalism at minimum. We have authority under the covenants that Mr. Pearson agreed to," Diane insisted, though her voice had lost some certainty. The officer shook his head. "Those covenants don't override state law. I'm going to have to ask everyone who doesn't belong here to leave immediately. We'll be taking statements and documenting the damage." The shed. Frank's masterpiece that had stood for 3 decades was completely demolished. Tools I'd stored inside were damaged or buried in the debris. Family photos I'd hung on the interior walls lay shattered among the splinters. Mark approached me looking genuinely distressed. "Nathan, I'm so sorry about this. I had no idea she was planning to do this today. I tried calling you when I found out." I was too angry to offer absolution. "Why didn't you stop her? This is criminal destruction of property." He looked at the ground. "You don't understand what she's like when she gets something in her head. But this is beyond anything I expected." As we were speaking, Lisa pulled me aside. "We need to document everything before anything else happens. We'll file for an emergency injunction to prevent any further action by the HOA, and then we're going to file a civil suit for damages." Over the next 2 hours, we documented the damage while the police took statements. Diane was issued a citation for criminal trespassing and destruction of property, with further charges pending investigation. As the afternoon wore on, more neighbors arrived, drawn by the commotion. Many expressed their shock and outrage at Diane's actions. Several admitted they'd had their own run-ins with her but had simply complied with her demands to avoid confrontation. The next morning, I took a personal day from work to deal with the aftermath. Around noon, I received an unexpected visitor. Frank Thompson, the original owner who had built the shed. Apparently, Walter had tracked him down and told him what had happened. Frank was in his 70s now, but still stood straight and strong. He surveyed the destruction with obvious distress. "I built that shed to last 50 years, he said quietly. "Used the best cedar I could find. Hand-selected every board." "I'm so sorry, Frank," I said. "I tried to protect it." He shook his head. "Not your fault, son?" As we were talking, Mark Holloway pulled into my driveway. He approached us slowly. "Nathan, I'd like to speak with you if that's all right." I nodded cautiously and he continued. "First, I want to apologize again for what Diane did. It was inexcusable." He glanced at Frank. "I don't believe we've met." "Frank Thompson," he introduced himself. "I built this house. And that shed that your wife demolished." Mark's face registered surprise, then a deeper discomfort. "Mr. Thompson, is your full name Franklin Thompson?" Frank nodded. "Franklin James Thompson. Why do you ask?" Mark closed his eyes briefly. "Because Diane's maiden name is Thompson. Franklin Thompson is her father's name." There was a moment of stunned silence. Frank's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization. "Wait a minute. Diane? Little Diane Marie? She married you?" Mark nodded grimly. 26 years ago. Are you saying you're her father?" Frank sat down heavily. "I lost touch with Diane after her mother and I divorced. She was 12, and Linda got full custody. Moved her to Chicago. I tried to stay in contact, but Linda made it difficult, and eventually Diane stopped responding to my letters. I haven't spoken to her in nearly 30 years. The irony was almost too perfect to be believable. Diane Holloway had demolished a shed built by her own estranged father on property he had once owned. "Does she know you live in Florida now?" I asked. Frank shook his head. "I doubt she knows anything about me. Linda probably told her I abandoned them." Mark looked genuinely distressed. "She never talks about her father. When I've asked, she just says he wasn't part of her life." Frank stood up, a new determination in his eyes. "Well, I think it's time for a family reunion. Where is she now?" "At her office downtown," Mark replied. "She has a real estate agency on Maple Street. Thompson Holloway Properties. Frank nodded. She kept the Thompson name for business at least. Will you take me there? Mark hesitated, then nodded. Yes, she needs to face this. Later that evening, Mark called me. He sounded emotionally drained. I thought you should know what happened. Frank and I went to Diane's office. When she saw him, she recognized him immediately. It was intense. She broke down completely. I've never seen her like that. Apparently, her mother had told her that Frank abandoned them and never wanted to see her again. I can imagine, I replied, uncertain how to feel about Diane's emotional crisis given the destruction she'd caused. When we told her about the shed, that it was Frank who had built it all those years ago, she became physically ill. She kept saying she had destroyed the only thing she had left of him. Frank showed her pictures of when he built it, with little Diane handing him nails. She had completely forgotten those memories. What happens now? I asked. Diane wants to make full restitution, Mark said. She's prepared to pay for a complete rebuilding of the shed to Frank's original specifications, plus compensation for all damaged items. More importantly, she's resigning from the HOA board effective immediately. That's a start, I acknowledge, but there's also the matter of her illegal actions. The police have filed charges. She's aware, Mark replied soberly. She's prepared to face those consequences as well. The following week was a whirlwind of legal meetings and property cleanup. Lisa negotiated a comprehensive settlement that included full financial restitution, coverage of all legal fees, and a formal apology to be read at the next HOA meeting. Additionally, Diane agreed to community service and entered a diversion program to address the criminal charges. But the most surprising development came from Frank. He proposed rebuilding the shed himself, with improvements to the original design. More surprisingly, Diane asked to help, a chance, she said, to reconnect with her father and make amends. I was skeptical at first, but Frank was persuasive. People deserve a chance to fix what they've broken, Nathan. Not just the physical things, but the relationships too. So on a warm Saturday in June, reconstruction began. Frank arrived early with his tools and detailed plans. Diane came an hour later, dressed in jeans and a t-shirt, a stark contrast to her usual formal attire. Nathan, I know an apology isn't enough for what I did, she began, her usual confidence noticeably absent, but I am truly sorry. What I did was inexcusable, and I'm committed to making it right. I nodded, not quite ready to offer forgiveness but willing to accept the effort. Actions speak louder than words. Let's see how the rebuilding goes. Over the next 3 weekends, an extraordinary transformation took place, not just of my backyard but of the neighborhood itself. Frank supervised the reconstruction, teaching both Diane and me his techniques. Neighbors stopped by to help or simply to witness the unexpected collaboration. Walter installed custom lighting, the Patels contributed handcrafted cabinet pulls, Elaine organized a tool-raising party where neighbors donated tools to replace those damaged in the demolition. Even Mark Holloway learned how to sand and stain cedar planks to his father-in-law's exacting standards. The new shed exceeded the original in both beauty and functionality. Frank added skylights and improved ventilation. The interior featured custom workbenches designed specifically for my woodworking interests. On the day we completed the project, the entire neighborhood gathered for an informal dedication. Frank had secretly installed a small bronze plaque by the door that read, "Built with pride by 3 generations, Franklin Thompson, Diane Thompson, Holloway, and Nathan Pearson. May creativity flourish within." Diane, seeing the plaque for the first time, was visibly moved. She had changed over those weeks of working alongside her father, the rigid perfectionism giving way to a more thoughtful consideration of why rules matter and when flexibility is more important. "I lost sight of what matters," she admitted to the gathered neighbors. "I thought property values and conformity were more important than people and history. I was wrong, and I'm grateful for the chance to learn that lesson, painful as it was." The HOA itself underwent significant reforms in the aftermath. The architectural review process was completely overhauled to respect grandfathered structures. Decision-making became more transparent, with a new emphasis on community building rather than rule enforcement. As for Diane and Frank, they continued rebuilding their relationship long after my shed was completed. Frank decided not to return to Florida, instead purchasing a small house just a few streets away. I often see them working on projects together, or simply sharing coffee on Frank's porch. Sometimes the most valuable structures we build aren't made of cedar and nails, but of reconciliation and second chances. That said, I'm still extremely careful about documenting every home improvement project and keeping meticulous records of all HOA communications. Some lessons, once learned, aren't easily forgotten. And the shed? It's better than ever. I've hosted neighborhood woodworking classes there, teaching techniques Frank passed down to me. Diane occasionally joins, still learning from her father and making small amends with each perfectly planed board and carefully driven nail. It's not the outcome I expected when I found my shed being bulldozed, but sometimes the most damaged foundations can support the strongest rebuilds.